For the first part of our session today, I'm delighted to present our esteemed guests. Sorry, I think the previous slide. Yes, thank you. Our esteemed guests, Sandra Zatkovich, Leslie Oat, and Alessandro Ialamo, they will be sharing with us an overview on the importance of supporting infant and young child feeding in emergencies. And in general, it's really an overview on the why. I will first give the floor to Sandra, who will be giving an overview on breastfeeding and climate change. The floor is Sandra.
Thank you so much, Linda, and hello, everyone. It's such an honor to be here today alongside so many passionate and skilled advocates and practitioners from across the globe. I'm presenting today from Hamilton, Ontario, Canada, which is situated on the traditional territories of the Erie, Neutral, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Mississauga peoples, and home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island today. My aim over the next few minutes is to explore both climate change and breastfeeding subversion through a critical lens with the help of political ecology and ecofeminist theoretical frameworks, ultimately inviting us to consider the shared histories, overlapping vulnerabilities, and potential for integrating responses to these two important issues. Next slide, please. Sorry, just back one slide. Forward one. I think we're skipping the political ecology. We had it up before with the pipeline. I'll just sorry, back one more. I'll just go from there. We go. Sorry about that, everyone. So I first started exploring these interconnections as a student in an ecological public health course at the University of Toronto, which looked at human health as inseparable from our surrounding ecologies. So the course was in part informed by a political ecology approach, which holds that politics and ecology are fundamentally interconnected, and we cannot separate processes and dynamics of power from their ecological context. And that's a perspective that helps us see both breastfeeding and climate change as intricately related, both to each other and as components of a larger political economic system. So the key questions that a political ecology lens aims to answer are who or what lives and dies, and who benefits from this living and dying. Next slide, please. There we go. Similarly, an ecofeminist lens helps us to recognize the relationship between gender and the environment. An ecofeminist perspective holds that in addition to the exploitation of labor for its productive value, these systems of power and capital are upheld by unpaid debts to reproductive labor and the non-human environment. And reproductive labor can be defined as the unpaid work that occurs at the household and community scales, including childbearing, cooking, cleaning, child rearing, elder care, and of course, breastfeeding. And despite being foundational to the existence and functioning of society, this kind of labor is hidden and not assigned any value in traditional indicators like the GDP, which then go on to inform policy. Similarly, the non-human environment is treated as a gift, freely used by industry for both resource extraction and as a dumping ground for pollutants. And the negative outcomes are not adequately, if at all, addressed by industry actors who benefit from them, leaving others who do not hold the same levels of power to suffer the consequences. Next slide, please. So in keeping these theoretical frameworks in mind, we'll just look at the shared historical roots of our changing climate and the subversion of breastfeeding. The period of rising greenhouse gases since the Industrial Revolution has been dubbed the Anthropocene, defined by humans permanently and drastically changing the natural environment through industrial production and the associated carbon emissions. Using a political ecology framework, others have argued that a more accurate term would be the Capitalocene, which more accurately addresses the questions of who lives, who dies, and who benefits. After all, it's those communities who are least responsible for the effects of climate change that suffer its worst consequences, while corporations reap the benefit in the form of profits. Similarly, the subversion of breastfeeding and expansion of the formula industry comes at the expense of a safe, healthy, and secure source of food for women and children, and while at the same time breaking bonds between mothers and children and undermining cultural knowledge and social ties in communities across the globe. Today, the formula industry is valued at $55 billion and is projected to grow to $109 billion by 2027, made possible by aggressive and pervasive marketing of formula that targets vulnerable women and children. Next slide, please. So here, let's take a look at the overlapping vulnerabilities manifest on a global scale. So while my co-presenters and panelists will go further into detail, for now I just think it's important for everyone to know that breastfeeding provides a safe, secure, and easily available food source in emergency situations where formula carries enormous risks in those same situations. The countries represented here rank highest on the 2019 Global Climate Risk Index, which takes into account human fatalities and economic losses. These countries all have histories of colonization, are lower middle income, and generally rank low on the Human Development Index, which measures education, standard of living, and life expectancy. And we can see that none of these high climate risk countries reach the World Health Organization's target of 70% exclusive breastfeeding for infants under 6 months, and the majority land under 40%, including as low as 4.6% in the Dominican Republic. So the absence of breastfeeding undeniably removes protections for the health of women and children who already face high climate risk and additional socioeconomic challenges. Moreover, it's estimated that the global economic losses resulting from not breastfeeding are up to $341 billion. And from a climate resiliency perspective, this represents a missed opportunity for women and communities at high climate risk to build climate resiliency, as every household dollar spent on formula or avoidable medical expenses is one that is not spent on other foods, healthcare, improvements to household structures, or emergency savings. So I just want to wrap up by stressing the importance of recognizing the connections between our movements. Sorry, I should say next slide, please. The importance of recognizing the connections between our movements and the importance of collective action. So the truth is that any one cause in isolation, including breastfeeding protection, is unlikely to engage the sustained and broad public support that's needed to make real change and hold corporations accountable. By asking the right questions, like who lives, who dies, and who benefits, we can see the root causes between so many issues of our day are shared and also call for a shared response. So protecting breastfeeding means fighting for food security and sovereignty, labor rights, women and gender rights, the movement for Black lives, Indigenous rights, anti-imperialism, and of course, climate justice. In essence, our movements need to reinforce each other to succeed. So with this message, I will pass it back to Linda and the next speaker. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you so much, Sandra. This is really enlightening and a reminder for us of how climate change and breastfeeding really intersect, how, as you say, recognizing this intersection is key to strengthen response to both problems you've explained, why a commitment to breastfeeding protection is an important determinant of really achieving health and ecological equity. So really appreciative of that. We will now move to our next presenter, Leslie Oat, who will further examine the importance of protecting, promoting, and supporting breastfeeding in relation not only to climate, but also to creating a sustainable and climate-friendly food system. Welcome, Leslie, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. And I'm really very happy to be here on behalf of USAID Advancing Nutrition and building off the work that I did while with the Alive and Thrive initiative. Today, I'll be adding to the key points Sandra brought up and speaking about why protecting, promoting, and supporting breastfeeding is critical to creating a more equitable, sustainable, and climate-friendly food system. Next slide, please. So current food system frameworks, such as the one shown here, fail to adequately address a critical part of the food system, breast milk, which is the first human food, and the critical factors within that food system that impact breastfeeding. Breastfeeding and other infant feeding behaviors are often portrayed as individual behaviors as a matter of free parental choice and the responsibility of parents alone. However, feeding decisions are not made in a vacuum and too often are influenced by factors that do not have the best interest of the baby and family at heart. Therefore, it is critical that as we have discussions about the food system, we understand how key determinants within that system influence early feeding decisions and ultimately nutrition and health outcomes. So there are three influencers on the food system that I'll be discussing today, and they're the impact of commercial milk formula, or CMF, on infant feeding behaviors, the impact of family-friendly policies on infant and young child feeding behaviors, and the impact of the CMF industry on environment and climate change. Next slide, please. Sorry, one more. Thanks. So why care about breastfeeding and its role in the food system? Breast milk is the optimal first food. It provides the infant its first vaccine, but also all the nutrients and water they need to survive and thrive. Breast milk even evolves and changes over time, fitting the needs of the baby as it grows, something formula simply cannot do. Substantial and well-known global evidence exists regarding the benefits of breastfeeding for the infant and maternal health and survival, including reductions in obesity and chronic illness. However, the benefits of breastfeeding go well beyond health. Breastfeeding can improve cognitive development among infants, which translates at a national level to higher intelligence levels and greater economic productivity. Breastfeeding is also a best bet for the private sector. Having breastfeeding supportive workplaces, which includes paid parental leave, paid lactation breaks, and access to private and clean spaces for expressing breast milks, helps to attract and retain high-quality staff, improves the company's brand and image, and often earnings, and reduces healthcare costs for companies. Next slide, please. So, how does the CMF industry impact breastfeeding and the food system? Commercial milk formula, which is an ultra-processed food source, is very, very big business. The CMF industry's growth over the past few decades is almost unfathomable. As Sandra pointed out earlier, global formula sales have increased from 1.5 billion in 1978 to 56 billion today, and is expected to reach around 120 billion by 2025. Formula companies now make more formula than children to consume it. But why does this matter? Formula companies use diverse and continuously evolving marketing strategies to change social norms and influence infant feeding, which significantly impacts global markets, diets, and ultimately the health and nutrition of babies. Much like smoking, once a baby is regularly fed formula and therefore a mother stops lactating, that baby is often tied to that product for the rest of their infancy. Something we saw has been a huge issue with recalls of formula here in the United States. While there are some children that may need formula, formula is not necessary for most infants. Furthermore, formula can be harmful as not only does it displace breast milk, but when promoted in context with poor water and sanitation, its use can be deadly. Babies who are exclusively breastfed are 14 times less likely to die than babies who are not breastfed. This reliance on CMF can lead to even worse outcomes during emergencies and natural disasters when access to clean water, hygienic means to sterilize bottles and teats are limited. Breastfeeding is an important safety net for mothers living in disaster-prone areas that are becoming more common due to climate change. Next slide, please. So, how does the CMF industry sell their products? As discussed in the new WHO report on how the marketing of formula milk influences our decisions on infant feeding, there are numerous ways in which the CMF industry utilizes their aggressive marketing to influence and prey upon caregivers' fears and emotions during a vulnerable time in their lives. I won't have time to go into all the ways I've listed on the slide, but as you can see, the CMF uses diverse and evolving tactics, including the use of traditional and social media, sponsorship of academic research and health professional events, and preying upon crises and emergencies to reach new markets. And much of this marketing is often illegal, violating national codes around the marketing of breast milk substitutes. But unfortunately, evidence shows that these tactics work. A recent study in Cambodia found that 86% of mothers surveyed in the capital Phnom Penh had seen or heard a commercial promotion for CMF. Furthermore, a recent study in the US found that 52% of caregivers agreed with a statement that infant formula can be better for babies' digestion and brain development than breast milk. The CMF industry's multi-billion-dollar campaigns to aggressively market their products drastically influence both the food environment and consumer behavior, often resulting in negative health and nutrition outcomes. Next slide. The impact of CMF marketing goes way beyond health, as it also has climate impacts. Breastfeeding, as the shortest food chain, is more environmentally friendly than the alternative, which uses substantial resources to produce, transport, and market. Overall, the food industry accounts for 30% of greenhouse gas emissions and 70% of fresh water use, and the manufacturing of CMF contribute to that. A 2016 study found that emissions created by producing CMF in just 6 Asian Pacific countries generated 2.9 million tons of carbon dioxide, which was equivalent to driving more than 6 billion miles by car. Furthermore, the production and consumption of CMF products also utilize a lot of water. It takes around 5,000 liters of water to produce just 1 kilogram of powdered milk. Recent studies have shown that even when CMF companies use more environmentally friendly means to produce their products, it's still far more efficient for the economy and the environment to promote and support breastfeeding. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, CMF are often the only choice for working mothers, as without the support of family-friendly policies and workplaces, maternal employment is a key barrier to exclusive breastfeeding in both the formal and informal sectors. A lack of family-friendly policies constrains mothers in their ability to choose how and when to feed their infants. Maternity protections and family-friendly workplaces have been shown to have a positive impact on the initiation, exclusivity, and duration of breastfeeding. For example, women allowed lactation breaks during work were 62 times more likely to continue breastfeeding than those who are not. But despite the benefits, only 40% of women with newborns have even minimal maternity protections, and this disparity only worsens in Africa, where just 15% of women with newborns have any protection. Without support from their families, their communities, and workplaces, many women have no option but to turn to CMF. So what can be done to protect, promote, and support breastfeeding to help build more equitable, sustainable, and climate-friendly food systems? Oh, I'm sorry, next slide. We need to ensure that women have access to quality breastfeeding counseling and services. We need to provide breastfeeding-friendly workplaces, ensure adequate paid parental leave. We need to rein in and control the aggressive marketing of the CMF industry, and this includes the incorporation and enforcement of the code by governments and demand for public committal from CMF companies to full compliance with the International Code of Marketing of Breast Milk Substitutes. And we need to work with communities to address the lack of maternity protections to find local and context-specific solutions. And lastly, we need to raise awareness around the impact of the CMF production and consumption on food security, climate change, and the environment. Next slide. Oh, and that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Leslie. Breastfeeding is the shortest food chain. Really love that. Powerful presentation taking us back to our first food system, the critical role of breast milk, playing in the food system, first food. You've really given us valuable food for thought on why it's crucial that we protect breastfeeding and promote it and support it for multiple reasons. So thank you so much for that, Leslie. While Sandra and Leslie have helped us understand why it's important to support, protect, and promote breastfeeding, contributing to climate change and the food system, next is Alessandro Ilamos, zooming in specifically on emergencies, climate-related and non-climate related, and the importance of supporting the nutritional needs of mothers, infants, and young children during emergencies. The floor is yours, Alex.
Thanks, Linda. Thanks to the colleagues that presented earlier. Yep, if you can. So we are going to look at infant prenatal feeding in emergencies, and my aim is really to not to convince our participants, but to ensure that we all see how, in particular, breastfeeding protection and support for women and children should remain a global and I would say universal priority also during emergency, as part of emergency response. Next, please. And I will, I'm not going to repeat the details, but I always want to ensure that we firm up what evidence and the global recommendations are telling us. And again, globally, universally, so, and you will hear me use these terms quite often. WHO and UNICEF and the global community in 2002, so 20 years ago, recommended the optimal or breastfeeding practices. So the skin-to-skin contact from birth, initiation within the first hour, exclusive breastfeeding during the first 6 months, and then continued up to 2 years or beyond. Now, these were universal recommendations. These are recommendations for all women in the world and for all of their children wherever they live. And I think it's very, very important we keep that in mind, because again, when we look at emergency response, we should be reminded that any woman and every child affected by an emergency needs such a support. Over, next. I think you have heard some of the figures. The situation is, in terms of breastfeeding practice, is not as we would like it to be. There has been some slow improvement, mainly in relation to exclusive breastfeeding. But what you can see from this graph from 2010, that to date, breastfeeding is one of the very few public health recommendations that is mainly practiced in low-income country. So there is a major call, and we do see we are seeing things. We are seeing some changes on this on the high-income countries level, where there is more awareness and more interest and some more support. But this is what needs basically yet to happen. A major push so that even breastfeeding practices increases in high income and middle income countries across the spectrum of the recommendations. Next. The life-saving narrative, I think, of breastfeeding is known to all of us, but I think it's always very important to reaffirm and to reiterate that this applies across all contexts. So we know, based on all the evidence that has been published recently, that breastfeeding alone could save more than 820,000 under 5 deaths. Next. there is an important evidence around the benefits for maternal health, and this is also in reiteration that when we look at breastfeeding and its benefits, yes, we need to keep mentioning the benefits for the child, but the woman as well needs to understand that the woman and the family and the community needs to appreciate the benefits for the mother itself. So there are important benefits, and one of them is breastfeeding can prevent at least 20,000 deaths if we look at the current rates of deaths caused by breast cancer, and additional 20,000 deaths based on the evidence we have could be also prevented if by increasing breastfeeding rates. So again, keeping the mother and the child diet together, also when discussing the benefits for them. Over. Next, sorry, not over. And I think Leslie did mention the economic benefit. And once again, benefits that are not just for poor countries, but if you see the analysis that was conducted in 2016, where it shows clearly how much countries like the US, UK, even China would benefit economically from an increase breastfeeding rates, and that if breastfeeding support is increasing and more investments are also provided. So the narrative on why breastfeeding is important across contexts and across regions, I think is quite powerful for all of us, and we need to keep it at the center of our conversation. Next. But what are our consistent and recurrent challenges in emergencies and non-emergencies? Certainly, and it was mentioned earlier, I will not discuss in much details, but is really our challenge with the breast milk substitute industry, what was called earlier the commercial milk formula industry, because of their aggressive marketing, and the WHO report that was published last month was very clear around that, because eventually the industry has only one objective, is to increase sales and volume of these products, and we know what that means in relation to our breastfeeding promotion and advocacy, because marketing undermines breastfeeding, as it has been said, because in many contexts marketing undermines also the integrity of our health systems, and also because, as has been said, because marketing of this product, it's marketing of products that may also not be sterile products at the source. So this is our constant, consistent challenge, and we will have to continue figure out ways to overcome it. Next. And then we have the IYCFE, the infant child feeding spectrum of things. Next. Where other challenges are also added. We know, just think about Ukraine nowadays, and the refugees and the people, the women moving, the displacement of those women, the stress caused by the conflict, for example, or in Afghanistan, or of any other context, even in the emergency happening in our own country, US, Italy, and so on. The fact that consistently, no matter the emergency where we are, there is a lack of support to those women, no? We are experiencing widespread donations, once again, also in the Ukraine situation. And the fact, as it happened during the COVID-19 pandemic, companies do exploit those situations. And so on the side, we have some examples of those experiences. But these are also the consistent, continuous challenges we face across contexts. Next. This is one of the reasons, one of the evidence-based justification why we would like to, we are calling for no donations of products because of their impact on the childhood diseases as well as on breastfeeding practices. Next. And what can we do? And this is where we need to be as creative as we can in our own positions and agencies. Next. Certainly is to be guided by all the guidance available, and I think there will be a presentation that will expound on it, but really guide and follow and comply and advocate for its compliance. Next. ensuring that our own governments will do better and do more around applying and enforcing those guidance. So very few countries have guidance related to infant feeding in emergencies among their emergency response agencies. Next. And this is just basically the same message. Very few attention, little attention is given to protocols focusing on infant feeding in emergency at the country level. Next. Next. And these are the questions for all of us. What can we do to increase investments? What can we do to ensure that our response plans and our emergency response agencies at the national and domestic level have the capacity and have the resources to support women and to protect breastfeeding? But the universal question is, what can we do to increase our support to women across all sectors and contexts? This is a question for all of us. Thanks again for listening. Over to you, Linda.
Thank you so much, Alessandro. Indeed, a reminder of the importance and the value of prioritizing and supporting mothers and infant and young child feeding in emergencies. In fact, thank you for all three speakers. You've helped me recognize and appreciate why it's important to prioritize the support of women, infants, and young children as in terms of their feeding as a contributor to multiple things such as decreasing climate change, improving the food system, and minimizing risks of mortality, morbidity in the context of emergencies. I think now it's time to actually hear firsthand from mothers. So we have a small video to show. Hopefully that will illustrate and help us hear from mothers.
Natural disasters are a part of life, and on September 20th, 2017, Hurricane Maria hit the island of Puerto Rico as a Category 5 hurricane. The path of destruction left in its wake was devastating to its residents and their family members all across the United States. Many mothers suddenly found themselves taking care of their families with no running water and no electricity.
Durante el transcurso del huracán María, yo estuve embarazada. Salía con mi mamá, con todo y barriga, a buscar agua, a pie. La situación era muy difícil para conseguir, ya sea hasta una bolsa de hielo. Después que yo di a luz, nosotros hablamos con él y él nos pasaba una extensión para por lo menos 2 abanicos y poder por lo menos tener un abaniquito para la nena.
For those moms who were breastfeeding, feeding their babies was one less thing to worry about and gave them a sense of security that their babies would have their next meal no matter where they were.
Gracias a que Nayara era lactada, yo no supe lo que era hacer filas de horas para ya sea un agua embotellada o para fórmula. Fue bastante bueno el efecto de yo darle el pecho a la nena, porque se me hacía así más fácil, porque conseguir una botella de agua durante ese tiempo era bien difícil, ya que las tiendas estaban cerradas, ya que habían veces que hasta se llevaban las cosas así, se las robaban. Si tienen la oportunidad de lactar a sus hijos, háganlo porque es lo mejor.
Thank you. A powerful video indeed, hearing directly from those affected, and again, a reminder for us. I believe there's, of course, a strong message that has come from our speakers, from the video around the significance of supporting, promoting, and protecting infant and young child feeding. We asked, however, and that was a question that our speakers actually also asked, and Alex has indicated some of the the infant and young child feeding component. And so what do we mean by infant and young child feeding in emergencies? And what does it mean to respond to the needs of mothers, infants, and young children? We have here a few illustrative pictures on this slide to help us visualize this. It's about protecting mothers from the harms of marketing of breast milk substitutes. It's about promoting appropriate infant and young child feeding, and it's about providing support for mothers and caregivers to successfully feed their children. And to continue learning more about infant and young child feeding in emergencies, and also to give us a real feel and experience of what this all means, I'm delighted to introduce you a panel of experts. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. Matt, Inez, Rufaro, and Magdalena, all three panel of experts who are here to share their experiences in relation to infant and young child feeding in emergencies. If I'm allowed, I will first address a first question, which we're looking forward to hear, the first of which is around the experience. And may I ask Matt, Inez, this question, please. Given your extensive engagement in responding to the needs of infants and young children in emergencies, I'm hoping you can tell us a little bit about your experience in strengthening specifically policies. And I know, of course, there's interconnectedness between policies, institutions, and community level activities, but focusing on policies to support infant and young child in emergencies in the Philippines.
Thank you. I have slides to show.
Yes.
And it's about how we were able to strengthen translating policies into practices, especially our milk code law, where we are involved in facilitating these passages. Next slide, please. Next slide is about how we overcome the typhoons. Next slide is about the typhoons, the earthquakes, and the volcanic eruptions. And in this next slide, we will be showing the survivors and evacuees of these calamities. So my organization, Arugaan, has engaged into breastfeeding help and rescue in calamity devastated areas. And we set up a breastfeeding tent and also counseling and women supporting women by sharing breastfeeding so that bottle-feeding moms can be relactated back to the power of breastfeeding. And we were able to protect and implement the 4 laws to protect breastfeeding. But, next slide, please. But the milk industry, the baby food industry, are very nefarious in their advertising, very subtly, in giving donations. Although the Department of Health firmly said, ban on milk donations. But they do in disguises in the act of charity. And they even use mayors, the local government, to distribute. And after the next supply, the moms are captive consumers. And because it is an emergency, the local government will be doing the budget purchasing of these inferior products that is very inimical to the health of the nurturers of the next generation. It undermines the power of breastfeeding. So for us, we were able to contextualize our action into appropriateness, into our culture, climate, and country. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matt, Inez. This is really powerful, and I hope it's also an encouragement to those of us listening to act, as you said. May I move also to Rufaro with a similar question? Also, if you could share your extensive engagement in responding to the needs of infants and young children in emergencies, but more focused at the facility level, institutional level. Rufaro?
Okay, thank you, Linda, for the question. Let me first say, in my 25 years of experience working with mothers, infants, and young child nutrition in Zimbabwe and Southern Africa, emergencies have become more prevalent in the past decade or so. I'll show an example. Can you? I'll be presenting mainly showing the role of the health institutions, but as an extension of health facilities, what we did using the community-based workers. Next slide, please. Yes, on the night of March 15, 2019, Zimbabwe was hit by tropical cyclone Idai, which caused riverine and flash flooding with subsequent deaths, disruptions of livelihoods, including infrastructure, and even 12 health facilities were destroyed. And this took place in the eastern part of Zimbabwe, which is bordering with Mozambique. Next slide, please. This experience that we had with the cyclone Idai led us to realize that we cannot continue to leave the emergency preparedness and the implementation of recovery plans to health institutions only. So in Zimbabwe, we actually worked on a multi-pronged approach whereby we strengthened community health systems as an extension of the health facilities. And in the same process, more than 350 IYC, infant and young child feeding support groups were established and supported in Cyclone Idai affected areas. We also trained health workers and in the IYCF emergencies during the emergency response preparedness plan. At the same time, we deployed additional health workers to the affected plan areas, so that at least we're looking at the community and the health workers and the support groups all together, working on this cyclone Idai and response plan. At the policy level, there was a joint statement on optimal infant and young child feeding in emergencies, which was prepared by government. I must say, Minister of Health quickly shared this policy with health workers and the health facility and all partners, so that at least they could work on it and get direction. In partnerships, we also had government, which received IYCF support from UNICEF, WHO, ADRA, GOAL, Save the Children, Nutrition Action and Zimbabwe, and World Vision. Next slide, please. Zimbabwe has a cadre called nutrition coordinators who also work at the ward level. These were redeployed to make sure that we had adequate staff to provide IYCF counseling, train and support village health workers in IYCF counseling, and also for active screening on acute malnutrition. They also monitored infant formula donations, which resulted in withdrawal for 1,600 tins of infant formula, and which had been donated by various organizations. And these formula tins were actually then redistributed to the health facilities through the Minister of Health. Next slide, please. Next slide.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Wafaro. You've given us a really nice overview on what can be done at the facility level and how also having having capacity building in non-emergency is really important to have health workers ready and deployed as you indicated. I will move now to Magdalena Woolery from Timor-Leste to also ask you, Magdalena, with your rich experience specifically at the community level and mobilizing the community to respond to the needs of infants and young children in emergencies, to also briefly give us your experience in doing that.
Okay, greetings. Yes, my name's Magdalena, and I'll be sharing specifically about what we did in Timor-Leste, establishing the first ever nurturing care centers of excellence. I have no conflicts of interest to disclose. Next slide, please. So many of you may be wondering, where is Timor-Leste? Well, Timor-Leste is one of the newest countries in the world. It gained independence from Indonesia, and it's situated between Indonesia and Australia. Its population is very small, 1.3 million. And during the end of March and beginning of April 2001, the country experienced heavy rains that resulted in flash floods and landslides that affected all 13 municipalities. There were over 40 deaths and over 30,000 households were affected, and the majority in Dili. And I'll be sharing more later about the work we did. Thank you. Next slide.
Thank you. We're excited to hear more about it. This is what we call whetting our appetite. So great. So we'll move to the second question to our dear panelists, and really to be able to learn. It's important to highlight some of the problems because it's not always easy. So I will address first Ines from the Philippines to, if possible, share with us key prominent challenges or barriers, but also possibly enablers and opportunities that you may have faced, and what were some of the key actions that you took to overcome them?
Thank you. The worst challenge we are encountering daily, it's still existing, are the milk industry's insidious predatory marketing. They're everywhere, from all institutions, from local government, for healthcare system, including direct to the mother, especially in this social media digital age. And also the perpetration of shaming and blaming women's sacred bodies to nurture through breastfeeding. So that is the challenge we are faced, plus the chemical contaminants in the formula milk feeding that wreck the environment. And the first one to be devastated, to be most affected in terms of health, are the vulnerable group, the mothers and the children. So, but how we able to overcome? We are watchful of our milk code because we were part of the passage of the code, and mothers now are reporting violations, and also the implementation is very weak. So I think we have to do the action. We have to do the action and join together with the implementers, the duty bearers, which is the government. So we are helping, but it's slow implementing of the law. So that is that very big challenge now. But they are profiting out of misery and malnutrition, especially during emergencies and calamities.
Thank you, Ines. So you're highlighting very much the importance of implementing the WHO Code of Marketing Breast Milk Substitute, of legislating it at the country level, and you're highlighting the challenge of lack of implementation, but also suggesting the importance of ensuring and maybe advocating for the implementation of the code and the legislation. So really important message there, and you have succeeded. So hopefully others will also reflect on this and examine how it can also be implemented in their own communities and countries. Thank you so much, Ines. I'll move also to Rufaro and highlighting again the challenges and enablers related to supporting facilities to respond to the needs of infants and young children and mothers for proper nutrition. Rufaro, I don't think we can see you. Not sure if you're coming on. Can we see?
Yes, yes. Yes, you know, during an emergency, everyone lends a hand. And whilst doing that in good faith, they can cause, you know, more harm sometimes. I must say our public health inspectors, as enforcers of the Public Health Act and statutory instruments on infant nutrition in Zimbabwe, did a sterling job during this emergency. There was active monitoring of donations of breast milk substitutes, complementary foods, feeding equipment, and these donations actually led, because they had to monitor, there was a lot of pressure on the government inspectors. Samples had to be sent to government analysts. They had to monitor every port of entry, and they picked quite some code violations.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, 400 kgs of infant formula, which had dated, were condemned. These were donated by a church organization. Some formula had languages on some tins that was so foreign, we could not even read them and nobody could understand. And faith-based organizations also ran parallel appeals for breast milk substitutes. So this became a challenge on our part. Next slide. Next slide. We also had inadequate health staff. You know, in looking at the health facility, there's a lot of high staff turnover, and to provide IYCF counseling. And the absence of lactation specialists for lactation support at the community level was also a challenge. So lack of specialized lactation support, especially for the traumatized mothers who gave birth to babies in the active phase of flight, actually was a major barrier and also a challenge. There was also limited capacity of actors in IYCF, which we experienced, which includes government actors, humanitarian volunteers, so that we could speak the same language of protection, support, and promotion of infant feeding and limit risks. So the enforcement of the infant food regulation statutory instrument also had lots of tensions as people were trying to enforce, but also created at the same time a good opportunity for us to educate our stakeholders. We realized that the National Civil Protection Guidelines that time did not include IYCF. So all these became challenges. Next slide. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rufaro. Really interesting. First, how you've linked the importance of having proper policies in place for the facility actions to function properly. You've also highlighted the opportunity, unfortunately, but also it's a reminder for all of us when there is no emergencies to actually be prepared and have in place the proper capacity and proper policies. So thank you so much for that. And I hope that the audience has reflected or has identified with some of these, and hopefully identified some opportunities and solutions. Magdalena, I'm sure also you've encountered challenges, and hopefully you have some tips on how you've overcome them and what were the actions that you've done.
Yes, I'm excited to share. Please, could you pull my slide up?
The next one, I think, yeah.
Okay, thank you. I see it. Yeah, so we had a lot of challenges. I think every emergency is challenging, but Timor-Leste is a country that suffers greatly from nutrition problems. We have very high maternal, child, and infant malnutrition. 1 in every 2 children under 5 years old is stunted. That's 50% of our under 5s. 1 in 24 children, so imagine a classroom of children. 1 in 24 under 5s will not live to experience their 5th birthday. And our biggest challenge was what my Ines had mentioned earlier, was that in an emergency industry, formula companies, bottle companies, they use it as an opportunity to increase their market share. And what we found in Timor-Leste is that we already had a malnutrition national problem, but there was this mass influx of formulas, bottles, milks, and other inappropriate products like instant noodles were being distributed across all the evacuation centers. Next slide, please. So here are some images from the evacuation centers. The one on the left, you can see the Sun baby cereal and milk powder SKM, that's from Dannon. The conditions in the camps are dire. There's often no water. There's no fuel. It's not clean. It is not an environment to for artificial feeding. The picture in the center is from an Indonesian bank. A major Indonesian bank had donated over 180 kilograms of infant formula in an evacuation center that didn't have clean water, and the mothers there were breastfeeding. There's often cross promotion and unethical distribution, so they give infant formula, you'll see in the hand of the mother, and Indo milk. And the photo in the corner, you'll see 2 little children eating milk powder from Indo milk, which is from Indo foods. And these are inappropriate and was our biggest challenge. Next slide, please. So what did we do? Well, we established nurturing care centers of excellence for the emergency and beyond, and it's based on the WHO framework of nurturing care. 5 components, including adequate nutrition, responsive caregiving, security and safety, early learning, and health. And when we piloted this in the evacuation center, Ministry of Health saw the results, and they asked UNICEF to please replicate in all our evacuation centers. And that's what we did. And we prevented maternal, mothers dying, children dying, and infants dying, and improved their health of them and their families. Next slide, please. So I'm really excited to share this because I think it's so important in emergencies that we target the most vulnerable. These are pregnant women, these are lactating mothers, these are formula babies on formula, and these are special needs babies and the malnourished. We did a lot of skin-to-skin contact, and skin-to-skin contact in emergencies is not often implemented, but it has so many benefits for the mother's health, but also for the child. One of the number one concerns in emergencies is, I'm stressed, I don't have enough milk. When a baby is on the mother's skin, the mother's body will produce a lot of milk, but also the benefits include reducing the risks of child abuse, and also reducing the risks of trafficking. Child trafficking is a big problem, and with skin-to-skin contact you have zero separation, so we provided baby carriers and so on. Breastfeeding protection, promotion and support, obviously. And we were innovative. We developed a breastfeeding doll, and that was amazing as part of the early learning. And of course, wet nursing, and developed a simple database, relactation and bottle amnesty. And you can see in the photo of the two young peer counsellors carrying a basket. They are doing the bottle amnesty, where simply that means sensitizing the mothers on the risks of bottle feeding, and with their consent exchanging the bottle for a cup. We did cup feeding, did traditional cooking of affordable local foods, avoiding all ultra-processed products, and emphasizing what we call rainbow foods, vegetables and fruits that are colorful and micronutrient dense, and prevented, intercepted and managed donations. And when I say we, it was the women in the community, the mother support group, the grandmothers that did all this, and we were supporting and building capacity. Next slide, please. Oh, and I'll share more in a bit.
Thank you so much, Magdalena. This is really, really interesting. Having the nurturing care, the capacity building, the empowerment of mothers that you're highlighting as a key contributor, and how you've overcome the challenge with an actual action that was replicated. So it's really something key that we can learn from. Thank you so much for sharing this. And a key message that I get from this is that it can be done, even in emergencies. And in emergencies, this is not when we don't do skin to skin, it's when we do skin to skin. And I saw all the claps from different participants. So thank you so much for sharing this. It's now time to talk further about success and the key factors to help us maximize this success. And I'll go back to Ines kindly for her also to share. Ines, how were you successful? What were some of the key factors? If you want to choose a few key factors to share with our participants to help maximize success in addressing the needs of infants and young children in emergencies.
We are ready anytime because of our breastfeeding preparedness. We are not anymore waiting for calamities to come in a shock. But many of our best team in Arugaan, my organization, breastfeeding expert support team, is ever ready to launch the breastfeeding response and rescue at any time. And we have set up a breastfeeding call center with breastfeeding help 24/7. And volunteers and formation of mother support group is getting bigger and wider, widespread. And it's a tandem service that we do breastfeeding counseling in a breastfeeding tent, and we use cup feeding, not the bottles, and no donations of formula. We empower women to be relactated back to breastfeeding, wet nursing, sharing of breastfeeding, also sharing of breast milk, and We don't use the palm, but we use our hands. So we tap innate resources. And hand in hand is the complementary feeding. We have community cooking, community kitchen, using indigenous foods that heals and nourishes, thus helping our local agriculture and economy, not importing products. So that is how we measure that success, where we are now confident that at any time, many mothers now will be responding in the same way. That's why they called our Arugaan the gold standard in emergency.
Indeed. Thank you so much for sharing. And we are ready. I think that's the key message that you're giving in terms of success. To be successful in responding to the needs, we need to be ready. So thank you so much. And I'm sure the participants would be eager to hear more, and hopefully we'll have the opportunity with the references that we're sharing. I will turn now to Rafaro kindly to also share with us her key factors in maximizing success, Rafaro, in terms of health facilities.
Okay. I don't know whether in emergency situations one can really say it was successful. It will be if you reduce risks and save mothers and lives. Yes, one thing we realized is that Zimbabwe has got a multi-sector food and nutrition policy that is managed by different sectors, multi-sectoral sectors. And that really helped the responses to be more integrated in and more multi-pronged in the process. And the clear guidelines, policy guidelines and direction that were provided during the time of need, that is the joint statement, I must say it was key. And this obvious was made possible by the SAGE support that we received from the Global Nutrition Cluster itself. And also the fact that the stakeholders created nutrition clusters that were established at different levels. That also helped a lot to maximize progress and also and to move forward. And I must say also the fact that if you go to the next slide, let's go to the next slide. The fact that community-based IYC was introduced in Zimbabwe, I must say it contributed to some positive factors because we're able to have village health workers that could address and easily trained in counseling without having to start from the beginning. And our public health regulations, the existence of the regulations, they contributed to success for implementation of our recovery plan. Next slide, please. I would like to acknowledge the government of Zimbabwe, Minister of Health and Child Care, the National Nutrition Unit, UNICEF Zimbabwe, IPFA and WABA from the global perspective. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rafaro, for this. You're highlighting the importance of preparedness also from the point of view of having the proper policy. So success came because there was effort in terms of having policy in place, but you also are highlighting the ownership from the government that also helped move this forward, and the role of the way you looked at this is the intersectoral way and the role of different sectors in making this a success. So really key messages and key points that you're highlighting. Thank you so much, Rufaro. And lastly, with Magdalena as well, if you could share some of the key successes, key points that make this a success at the community level, or even different levels?
Okay, well, you know, that is such an important question. I think you need to have the key policies, the protocols and the guidelines, but you can have the best of these. The key is, though, you can have the best in the world, but it has to be implemented. And if it's not implemented, it's not effective, it's not going to make an impact. And so very important for the success was implementing the WHO Code of Marketing. Very important was the operational guidelines for infant young child feeding in emergencies. And most importantly, really, in the Timor-Leste example, and I think in other emergencies as well, is the global infant young child feeding guidelines, because we have to remember, and often we forget, number one, the priority is the mother breastfeeds directly. Okay, if that's not possible, then number two, the mother expresses and her breast milk and gives it to the baby in the cup. If that's not possible, then a wet nurse. It's in our global infant young child feeding guidelines. It's not around the world of implemented. And if that's not possible, donor milk. And the last resort is formula in a cup. Right. So for us in the Timor-Leste emergency, it was very important to have these simple message based on WHO infant young child feeding guidelines, and to do mass sensitization, educating the community. But the most important thing, I think, the takeaway is that support women, because empowered women are unstoppable. And we're not always going to be there. So the community has to be empowered in future emergencies, and there will be more emergencies. So what you're doing is empowering the community to be heroes, to be code heroes, to be breastfeeding champions. Next slide, please. So success. You know, when we look at the numbers, Timor-Leste is a small country, but we were able to support over 1,000 families from nurturing care centres of excellence, 571 children under 5 years old, over 600 mothers, lactating women and pregnant women. Now, nurturing care is under the directive of the National Mother Support Group, so it will continue with support from partners like UNICEF and WHO and so on. And I think most importantly, though, we see these statistics on our screen, but behind that statistic is a child. And I just want to share the before and after of one of the many children we helped. Is a 2-year-old boy in Timor-Leste, and I have consent to share the videos and photos. We found him in one of the evacuation centres that hadn't received support yet, and so we quickly mobilised and set up a nurturing care space. He was one of the many children that have malnutrition, severe acute malnutrition, and his MUAC reading, it's a measurement of the arm, was 11.2 and on red, and red is a danger sign for us, risk of death. Please, could you play the video? I just want us to see behind the statistics. Okay, and next video, please. Okay. Pause, please. Thank you. I just wanted to show just how malnourished he was. But the wonderful thing is his mother was breastfeeding his little sister, and we were able to support the mother to teach her how to express her milk and give it to her son in a cup. When we found the little boy, he had respiratory tract infection, he had diarrhea, he had a fever, he was pyrexic, and he was in a critical state. And I'd like to share the last video.
I think we ran out of time.
And this is, for us, this is success.
Yes, absolutely.
So he's thriving. When we found him and counseled him, we found out he was living off Nestle Dancow milk and instant noodles. He was so wasted. And, you know, nurturing care saves lives. And it is a wonderful success story for Timor-Leste and for the government of Timor-Leste Ministry of Health and Alola Foundation. And I thank them for this opportunity to help support our women and children there. Thank you very much.
We thank you, Magdalena, really very powerful. And I feel that I'm really eager to you know, seeing all this and hearing all of you, eager to make a contribution, eager to have to act. And so hopefully we have set the stage in terms of why it's important, what it looks like. But then I ask myself, how can we contribute to this change given each person's role, right? So the participants. So to help us actually answer this question, I'm delighted to introduce Isabel Modigel, who will give an overview of some existing guidance and tools, which hopefully will be useful for us all. Maybe I just take the 1 second to thank panelists as we close the panel session. Thank you. Over to you, Isabel.
Thank you so much, Linda, and it's so great to be here with all of you today. So I'm Save the Children's Global IYCFE Advisor, and I'm also currently working with the IFE Core Group as the focal point for the Ukraine response. So really in the middle of it and trying to disseminate tools. I have no conflicts of interest to declare to you today. So now that you have all been convinced, hopefully, by my inspiring colleagues, just how important it is to really remember the needs of infants and young children and caregivers during climate-related emergencies, I hope you're wondering how to get started. And so my task is to introduce you to some of the key tools that you can use to do just that. So there are really a lot of strategies out there and frameworks and policies which set out our various responsibilities in IYCF and IYCFE, some of which we've already seen mentioned earlier on in today's session. And the three that sort of are popping up in red are absolutely critical for IYCFE. So let's get started by looking at a couple of those. Next slide, please. So we'll start with the emergency focused resources. And if you have ever worked in any kind of emergency, then hopefully you will already recognize this resource, which is the Sphere Handbook. And this really outlines what are the minimum standards for all emergencies, no matter where we are in the world. It really aims to improve the quality of assistance to people who are affected by emergencies, as well as our accountability to them. It was first launched in 1997, and it's now really recognized as the most widely known set of humanitarian minimum standards out there, which we must always strive to achieve, if not do better. And within the Sphere Handbook, IYCFE is one of the key areas with 2 standards, which you see here on the screen. So if you really want to understand what the bare minimum is that we should always be doing, then the Sphere Handbook is a good place to get started. Next slide, please. Now, for more detail on how to implement these minimum standards, as well as various other key policies and strategies, we head to the operational guidance on infant and young child feeding in emergencies. This was first developed way back in 2001, and it was co-created by many of the agencies whose logos you see here and led by the IFE core group. And over the years, they've really contributed their expertise and operational guidance and come up with this very concise, practical little book. So I've got it here so you can see, you know, it's really a good thing to pop in your luggage when you're going to an emergency. And it was first endorsed by the World Health Assembly in 2010. We're currently on version 3, and there is really something in there for everyone, from policymakers to donors to emergency responders. Next slide, please. So a little bit more about it. There are 6 key sections, which you can see here. So it goes from policy right down to the practical details of how can I protect a formula-fed baby in an emergency and minimize the risks to them. It's available in over 10 languages. And I really, really encourage you to take a look as a starting point. Next slide, please. Now, of course, although it's very handy to have such a concise little book, sometimes we want more detail. So recently, the IFE core group published a series of infographics which unpack some of the parts of the guidance that we notice that users often have more questions about. And they're for lots of different audiences, from midwives right up to policymakers. And I've listed them out for you here. As an example, maybe number 2 might be of particular interest. How do we stop these inappropriate donations that we've been talking about from happening, so we don't end up with tons of products which we potentially need to destroy or dispose of? Not something that we want to be doing in an emergency when waste management is often a real challenge. So we don't want to be adding to the problem. Next slide, please. So another useful resource to start with is this multi-sectoral framework, which was developed by Save the Children and UNHCR. So while IYCF is often coordinated by the nutrition sector, it is really everybody's responsibility in an emergency. And this framework is going to tell you what yours is. So its purpose is really to provide guidance across sectors on what we all need to be doing so that we're creating an IYCF-friendly environment. So by that I mean, how do we enable caregivers to practice IYCF as recommended, despite the fact that they find themselves in an incredibly difficult situation? And we do that by taking advantage of all the different contact points and services for pregnant and breastfeeding women and their children. So there's lots of IYCF-sensitive activities in there, from what solid waste management needs to look like for infants and young children, to how we can ensure that the unique nutritional needs of young children are met in times of food insecurity, which may well be caused by a climate-related emergency such as drought. And although you can see here that the focus is on refugee situations, it can really easily be adapted to other emergency contexts as well. So whether you work for a UN agency or a local NGO, you will really find something in there that you can do to support mothers and babies in an emergency. Next slide, please. Now, you might find yourself in a new emergency. And if that's the case, the first thing to look for is the joint statement. Pictured here on the right is the joint statement that was just released in response to the crisis that we have seen erupting in Ukraine. So this is an advocacy tool which highlights relevant policy you need to be aware of. It will clarify government position on donations and provide some context-specific guidance and calls for action to stakeholders. And again, the aim is to be creating this enabling environment for caregivers. So I do encourage you to take a look if you're in any way involved in the Ukraine response or other emergencies. Next slide, please. And perhaps you find yourself in a climate-related emergency. as you can see on the photographs here, the chances are in these kind of situations that mothers are really going to need a safe and comfortable space where they can feed and care for and connect with their babies. So when their homes are destroyed or they've had to leave them behind, this is a very simple but powerful action that you can take to create a space and a moment of calm and connection for caregivers and their babies, which we then also know really facilitates breastfeeding. So pictured here is a technical brief, which was developed by the GNC Technical Alliance, and that tells you how you can implement this priority action. Next slide, please. Now, just a couple of quick IYCF resources. Strengthening IYCF practices in non-emergency times is also essential. Next slide, please. Investing in breastfeeding is a crucial component of emergency preparedness. When we improve breastfeeding practices in non-emergency times, that lowers babies' vulnerability during emergencies and will foster individual and family and community resilience. A breastfed baby is a food secure baby, and this is really important as we're seeing more and more climate-related emergencies which are resulting in food insecurity. Next slide, please. So a really good place to start is the code. You've heard it mentioned a couple of times, and this sets out the responsibilities of the infant food industry and health workers, governments, and organizations. All of us have a role to play in some way, whether it is to enact it, to monitor it, to enforce it, or to simply respect it. So if we can get this set up well before an emergency strikes, this is really helpful in protecting babies when a crisis does occur. Next slide, please. Another really helpful thing we can do is to improve access to skilled breastfeeding counselling in non-emergency times. Then it's much easier to scale up and adapt in an emergency. So here you can see 2018 WHO guidelines. In the middle, there's implementation guidance on how to set this up in a non-emergency setting. And on the far right, how you can then adapt your practice rapidly in the event of an emergency. And the last resource that I wanted to briefly share with you, next slide, please, is if you want to find out more. So I've already given you a very quick whistle-stop tour of various actions you can take. But if you want to do even more to support our next generation, then I recommend that you check out the Global Breastfeeding Scorecard to see what the call to action priorities are at the moment. So it examines national performance against key indicators, and it will tell you what the current priorities are. Last slide, please. And if you want to know even more, I have listed some resources for you here. We will be providing a handout with all the tools I just presented. There are platforms available where you can seek peer support or via the GNC Technical Alliance request technical support and advice in the form of deploying a specialist or remote support or asking for a consultant to come and work with you. And on the right-hand side, you will see repositories with all the main tools to get you started. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Isabel. This is really useful and filled with information. So definitely useful to have the links so that we can go back to them. And of course, we have to start somewhere, and you've given us an idea on where and what we can do and where we can ask for help. Just in the interest of time, we realize that we are over time. There were a few questions that were asked, and so I encourage you all to go to the link that was shared and to please look at the answers there. And of course, the recording will be shared. And I invite you all to please just stay a couple of minutes for us to close the event. Just wondering if there are any questions that we need to address. I think that yes. So I think that for now we will try to close given in the interest of time. And I wanted to share that certificates of attendance will not be issued for today's presentation, but a recording will be available as mentioned. So after what we've heard from our speakers and panelists and mothers, I really hope that we've given you a reason to act, a reason to promote, support, and protect infants and young children in emergencies, including the climate-related emergencies. But how can you do that? We have heard a lot of suggestions, of course, from the different speakers. We've put here on this slide a few suggestions depending on where you're from and in which position you are in. But of course, the first of which is to ensure the funding for protecting, promoting, and supporting infant and young child feeding for all mothers, caregivers, and their infants, to include actions and resources. We've seen so many resources here, but here we're talking more about funds that are needed to protect, promote, and support infant feeding in emergencies. We've talked about preparedness and to invest in preparedness in response and recovery. Adopt and implement the codes, a key message that came out today, and the operational guidance, that yellow book, as instruments to protect mothers, caregivers, and children. And of course, wherever you are and whoever you are, raise awareness across all the population on the importance and the value of supporting infant and young child feeding. Today, I'm joining you from Lebanon, and it's Mother's Day. And on this occasion, I really hope that we can all celebrate supporting, but also empowering women and mothers in their role as instruments of change, namely contributing, of course, to climate change, food security, health, nutrition. I thank you all for your active listening, but I also have to thank my colleagues. Next slide, please. Next slide, please, thank you, of course, to all our speakers and task force members whose names you are seeing here and who are behind this event. We really hope that you've enjoyed it. We really hope that we contributed to some change in the world to improve the health and nutrition of women and children. I take this opportunity to thank the Global Breastfeeding Collective, colleagues from the IFE core group for their tireless efforts to prepare and execute this event. And thank you so much for joining us. And until we meet again, I wish you a great rest of the day. Thank you.